The House Rules Committee met today on Capitol Hill to begin the first of two hearings concerning the investigation into the so-called October surprise. That refers to allegations that the 1980 Ronald Reagan for President campaign made a deal with Iran's government to delay the release of the 52 American hostages still being held in Tehran until after Mr. Reagan's January 1981 inauguration. Recently, the House leadership agreed to set up a task force to look into those allegations. Wednesday's Rules Committee hearing focused on the mechanics of setting up the organization which will investigate. Coming up next, we bring you those proceedings, which are chaired by Congressman Joseph Moakley, Democrat from Massachusetts.
On August 5th, House Speaker Tom Foley announced that he would request a special task force to thoroughly investigate these allegations and lay them to rest. On October 23rd, H.Res. 258 was introduced by Representatives Hamilton, Gephardt, Fasell, and Derrick. H.R. 258 provides for the creation and authorization of a special task force consisting of members of the Foreign Affairs Committee to investigate allegations that in 1980 the Reagan presidential campaign conspired with the Iranian government to delay the release of the United States hostages until after the November election. The Rules Committee takes up H.Res. 25 today as a measure falling within the committee's original jurisdiction. Under Clause 1Q of Rule 10, the Committee on Rules has jurisdiction over rules and joint rules and the order of business of the House. Pursuant to this rule, the committee has the prerogative to report measures creating committees, directing them to make investigations, and bestowing certain authorities upon task forces that they would not otherwise have if established by a select committee, subcommittee, or full committee. The ranking minority member, Mr. Solomon.
Mr. Chairman, let me just say it's with some ambivalence that I approach this hearing today on the so-called October surprise resolution. On the one hand, I'm just as interested as anyone in this House that we establish the truth or the falsity of rumors that anyone may have been involved in any kind of illegal or unethical acts relating to the release of American hostages in Iran in 1980. On the other hand, I'm so concerned that tracking down rumors that are over a decade old may well be a futile and a very expensive proposition. And I just wish this Congress would pay attention to expensive propositions. Moreover, I'm just concerned that some who are pushing for this may have their own political agenda. This latter suspicion is only confirmed for me by the majority's insistence in not including the Carter campaign administration under the scope of the same inquiry as did the Senate just the other day. I just don't buy the argument that President Carter should somehow be immune from scrutiny because he was the President of the United States. That didn't stop this Congress from conducting the Iran-Contra investigation of the Reagan administration. And incidentally, that inquiry involved a similar set of circumstances involving the alleged swap of arms for hostages. I would also point out that the companion inquiry in the other body yesterday voted to include, as I said before, the Carter administration with its inquiry. They voted to include it. For us to do less only makes it look that we are perpetrating some kind of a cover-up, and we should not be doing that here today. I say let's have a thorough investigation if we must have one. Let the leads take us where they will, to whomever may be involved, and let the chips fall where they may, but it has to include the Carter administration, which falls under the jurisdiction of the time limitation of what we're investigating here. So, Chairman, you know, another concern of ours is the lack of any kind of deadline on this inquiry. The Hamilton resolution calls only for a progress report next July, but the task force would be authorized to continue until December of 1992 if it so desired, after the election. This again raises a suspicion that this may be politically motivated to spring in an October surprise on Republicans on the eve of next fall's election. I think the investigation would have more credibility and more bipartisan support, incidentally, if we limit it to 6 months, subject to an extension by the House, and I'd vote for such an extension if there is a compelling need to do so. The resolution by our Republican leader, Bob Michael, who will be testifying in just a few minutes, contains such a 6-month deadline on extension provisions, and it also includes the Carter administration and campaign within the scope of this inquiry. So we're going to have a chance to vote on that. And finally, Mr. Chairman, I would note that the sponsor of the majority's resolution, the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Hamilton, whom I serve with on the Foreign Affairs Committee and have the greatest respect for, is also the sponsor of a resolution with Mr. Gradison to create a joint committee on congressional reform. And as a co-sponsor of that resolution and one who thinks we do need to clean house around here, I think our time would be better spent reforming this Congress for the next decade and beyond rather than trying to prove or disprove rumors from a decade ago. Mr. Chairman, we're going to have testimony on this. We'll be certainly offering amendments to include the Carter issue, to include the 6-month duration, and to talk about money being spent on this. $40 million on the Iran-Contra issue, in my estimation, was money down the drain. So I hope we will have the cooperation of the Democrats on this committee when we mark up the bill, and let's come out with something that's going to be beneficial to the American people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Derrick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am one of the sponsors of this resolution, and I am a sponsor of this resolution because I believe that it is a matter that the Congress should look into and look into in depth. I, like most members, to even think of the possibilities, it makes my blood curdle. You know, what we're talking about here in the extreme is almost treason. In the other extreme is nothing happened. I would think that those who have been implicated would be the first who would call to have the truth brought forth. And I believe that there are 3 conclusions that can be reached by this investigation. One is guilty as charged. The other is not. And the other is inconclusive. The last 2, I think if those conclusions are reached, it should be declared that the matter is over and that those are involved were in fact not involved and that they are not guilty, so to speak, to use the terminology. But these are very serious allegations that have been made. The allegation has been made that private citizens were in collusion with a foreign government to thwart the policy of our government at that time. I do not recall in my lifetime that any more serious charges have been made against public officials. We must say to the rest of the world that for the future, that you must deal with properly elected representatives of our government in matters such as this. And that if you don't, that our properly elected government, the Congress of the United States, will not tolerate that. We need to look into this for our own self-satisfaction and come to a conclusion and put it out of the way. It is quite frankly something that I have been interested in and concerned about for over 10 years. I first could not understand why these hostages were turned loose in a matter of an hour or so after President Reagan was sworn into office back in 1980. This did not appear to me to be consistent. There was some inconsistency there. It was something that bothered me. And it apparently bothered other people. And I followed it as close as I could over the years, and when Mr. Sick came out with his op-ed piece in the New York Times back some time ago, I immediately on that day wrote the Speaker of the House as well as the Majority Leader of the Senate, and suggested that the matter should be looked into. So I know that I do not come to this investigation in any partisan sense, and I know that the chairman, Mr. Hamilton, whose reputation is beyond reproach in these matters, does not come with any partisan angle in mind, but truly to get to the bottom of this for the benefit of this great country of ours, and to say, if it happened, it will never happen again. Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Quillen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Here we go again. Another witch hunt, millions of dollars expense for the taxpayer, and I'm assuming, and it looks to me like it's going to be an entirely a partisan investigation. I hope that we can include the Carter administration, because the events being investigated go back as far as 1979 under the Carter administration. Tried to hang Ollie North. He came clear after spending $40 million plus. We get into this, and there's no question that the matter should be cleared as far as the American public is concerned. And I hope the resolution offered by our minority leader and others will be embraced, and I hope the amendments being offered will be embraced to include the Carter administration. How can you justify spending millions of dollars in a way that does not complete the wheel and leave some of the spokes out? I feel that this investigation, if authorized, should get underway and be a limited investigation for the benefit of our taxpayers and for the benefit of the American people. Yes, everything we do now seems to be geared towards the presidential election. I don't think it's becoming to the American people. They're getting fed up with what's going on here in the Congress, that we are fighting a cause that would lead ultimately to the election next year. So I say, Mr. Chairman, hopefully the minority voice will be heard. Hopefully that if the investigation takes place, and it looks like it will, that it will be all embracing and the facts will not be covered up, and it will not cost the taxpayers an unusually large amount of money. And I think that's where we're headed. I mean, how can you have two investigations going on simultaneously? It's expensive. To me, it doesn't make sense. So hopefully, after we hear the witnesses, this committee will do the right thing and make it all embracing rather than a one-sided investigation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Quillen. Mr. Hall of Ohio.
Mr. Chairman, very briefly, I too hope that the allegations are not true. I believe that the charges and the rumors are serious enough that really they should be looked into. I feel confident that the task force will do its job. It will be bipartisan. I believe they will be fair, and I'm confident in that because of the character and the quality of the members that are on the task force. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Hall.
The rule is about to be taken up on the Foreign Aid Conference report, and Mr. Hall and I have to carry that rule. If you would excuse us for a few minutes, we'll go down and get that out of the way. We'll be right back.
We'll try to carry on without you.
Thank you, sir. Come on, Tony.
Anybody else have an opening statement? All right. If not, the Honorable Lee Hamilton.
You have one?
Do you know if Congressman Fasella is going to be here today?
Mr. Chairman, I was informed that he would be here, and I would, of course, defer to him. He may be on the floor because of the Foreign Aid Bill Conference report. If he comes in, of course, I'll be glad to defer to him. Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the committee, I thank you for the opportunity to appear in behalf and in support of this resolution. Let me just talk to several points. The first point, I think, is why you have an inquiry here at all. Several members have already answered that. You really have very, very serious allegations here. If these allegations are true, then there certainly was a threat to our constitutional processes. There may be more problems than just a threat to the constitutional process. There may have been violations of law. And if the allegations are not true, then we want to remove the rumors that have floated around for so long and the stain on a good many people's reputation. I don't think it's sufficient at this point to say that there is insufficient proof of any allegations. We simply don't know that. There have been all kinds of allegations out there, and we don't know the truth or the falsity of those allegations. We pursue this inquiry because the Speaker has asked us to do so, the Majority Leader in the Senate, but 3 presidents have spoken to it. And the hostages, or at least some of the hostages themselves, have asked us to have an investigation. Presidents Carter and Reagan, and I have the quotes in front of me if the committee is interested in it, have asked us to pursue an investigation. President Bush has said that he wants to get to the bottom of these things. How do you get to the bottom of these allegations? How do you get to the bottom of these very serious charges unless you have an official body with subpoena power that is prepared to look into them? I don't know how else you do it other than through some kind of an investigation. The Congress, of course, has a tough job here. We are looking at facts that are very old, and whether or not we will be able to find anything, I just don't know. I enter this investigation, as Mr. Solomon said he did a moment ago, wanting to let the facts lead us. And that's my full intent, and to let the chips fall where they may. But I think the seriousness of the allegations demand that the Congress ascertain the facts. Now, just secondly, a word about how we would proceed if the resolution is adopted. The Speaker and the Majority Leader, in letters to Chairman Fasell and to Chairman Pell in the other body, indicated how that mandate would be pursued. We would first of all examine the paper trail associated with these allegations. We would take depositions from witnesses, and then once that stage of the inquiry were completed, we would make a determination whether or not there are enough facts to go forward with public hearings and whether public hearings are warranted. The inquiry should be structured in such a way that it can be stopped or altered at any point if the facts demand changes in procedure or if the facts demand termination. The minority have some genuine concerns, and I don't want to make light of those concerns, but let me speak to them. First of all, the concern that the resolution explicitly extend the task force mandate to include allegations with contacts between the Carter administration and Iran with respect to a possible arms deal. A couple of things about that. First of all, the language of the resolution as it is now drafted is broad enough, in my view, to permit all matters related to the allegations concerning the Reagan campaign to be looked into, and that would certainly include the policy context at the time these events are alleged to have occurred. We say there that all matters related to the allegations may be looked into. So if in fact in a deposition that is being taken, one of the minority or one of the majority wants to ask questions with regard to the Carter activities, the Carter policy at the time, it seems to me that the resolution covers that. The scope of this investigation is certainly not predetermined, but I must say to you that I don't have any information suggesting that the Carter administration tried to work out an arms deal with Iran prior to the 1980 election. I just don't have any information about that. And that's why the language with respect to the Carter administration is not here. There's another reason as well. There's a very important difference, obviously, between alleged contacts by a President of the United States and his administration with another government with respect to American hostages, and, on the other hand, the alleged contacts between private parties and a foreign government. So I don't think the language is necessary. I understand the Senate took some action on this the other day. I've asked for that language. I've not seen it. I'll be glad to consider that, but I really don't think the language is necessary. Now, secondly, the complaint that is made or the concern that is expressed relates to time. Everybody can appreciate the validity of that concern. I certainly do not want to drag out this investigation. But I've had some experience with time limitations, and I know that when you're dealing with an investigation into fact, it is just very, very difficult to hit time targets. And those time limits can become very genuine constraints on the conduct of an investigation. You simply do not know, almost by definition, the kinds of problems you're going to run into in an investigation. In the Iran-Contra investigation, it took us a long time, I don't recall the exact figure, but a long time to get clearances for key staff members. I don't think anybody was dragging their feet on that. It just is difficult to do, and it takes a lot of investigation by the FBI and others. And nobody can say that we can get a clearance for you within so many days. Almost certainly we would be dealing in this investigation with foreign governments. Now, when you deal with foreign governments, you deal through foreign ministries. And you cannot force that process. You have to go through elaborate procedures when you deal with foreign governments. And it is a time-consuming matter over which the investigators really do not have complete control. There is plenty of evidence here to suggest that this investigation will be looking into matters that may have occurred around the world, and that means there is some complexity to it. So I want to be reasonable and cooperative on this question of time. Nobody wants to push this through more quickly, I think, than I do. I'm anxious that it be resolved very quickly. But I see lots of problems by putting a time certain into the resolution by which the investigation must be completed. Now, in order to help allay some of this problem, and I recognize it doesn't meet it completely, we have said that we would report by a certain date, and that gives us a kind of a target to shoot for. Finally, Mr. Chairman, let me just say that I don't think there is anything that I can say that it can allay the concerns and the suspicions of some who have doubts about this resolution. But it is, I guess, worth observation that I think there's plenty I can do with respect to some of those concerns. And what I can do, and others on the task force can do, is to try to conduct this investigation thoroughly, professionally, and fairly. And I will do my level best to do that. I would much prefer that we have bipartisan support. I recognize this is not an easy resolution for the minority to come join and support. I fully appreciate that. But I've worked with all of the members on this task force, both Democrats and Republicans. They are very good members of this institution. And once we get away from the posturing, once we fire the political shots that I know will be fired here and I'm sure on the floor of the House, after all of that smoke is cleared and the resolution is adopted, I and some others will be charged with the responsibility of conducting this investigation. and I want it to be done carefully and professionally and fairly. With regard to staff budget, I can only say to you that my intent at this time is to have a very small staff hired from the outside. It is my hope that we'll be able to draw upon a large number of very excellent staff people already on the House committee staffs, and to keep the outside newly hired staff down to a minimum. I know you will ask me at some point just what I have in mind there. I'm afraid I can't be precise except to say that I only plan to hire professionally a handful of people at this point in time. But here again, you have to see how the investigation unfolds. And it may be that we will need certain kinds of professional skills down the line, and we certainly ought to have the authority to hire those skills if necessary. So, finally, let me say that I know the President's role is always important in these matters. President Bush has said that he has no involvement, no knowledge of any discussions or agreements with respect to Iran. I accept that, his statements, and I do not think his involvement in this alleged matter is now an issue. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I urge the committee to adopt the resolution and to proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hamilton. As you alluded to, the Senate has already included in their resolution the name of President Carter, and you feel that in the investigation, the way it's proposed before this committee, that things could be looked into under the President Carter's term. Why then is why is not the name of President Carter in the resolution?
The name of President Carter is not in the resolution because the allegations don't pertain to President Carter. And he was the President of the United States. He had the authority to conduct American foreign policy. The allegations here are that the campaign team of then candidate Reagan made contacts with Iran.
No, I understand.
You understand the allegations. Those are the central allegations that a deal was struck. Now,
but the thing I'm trying to do is trying to get rid of the political situation. If the Senate has included it in their resolution, you know,
I've indicated I haven't seen the Senate.
Well, I haven't seen it either.
As I indicated in my comments, I would be happy to consider that. Let me say to you, I think it is as a pragmatic matter, is not particularly important. We have in the resolution today all matters relating directly or indirectly to the foregoing. That's very inclusive language. You can put whatever you want to in it. As a practical matter, if Mr. Hyde or Mr. Michael or someone in a deposition or in a public hearing, if it comes to that point, wants to pursue the Carter policy at the time, I think this resolution gives them full authority to do so. And it would not be my intent to try to stop it. I think it would be very unwise to stop it.
Let's see, I'm just trying to get rid of as many blockades that may separate the parties in this matter, and as long as you're convinced that the way the resolution is written, that it would allow them to go into the Carter administration.
Well, of course, I think the key question to ask, Mr. Chairman, is if we put that language in, would they therefore vote for the resolution?
Might be a great question.
And I think that's probably the key question to address.
Thank you. Mr. Derrick.
I would suggest to you that, you know, there are two reasons. The main reason is, for goodness sakes, Jimmy Carter was President of the United States at that time. He was authorized by his election and under the Constitution to negotiate and to do whatever he saw fit with foreign governments. You know, to include something about Carter in there, why don't we investigate the Ringling Brothers circus fire in 1939? all that is a dilatory tactic, because the more you include in, the more possibility it is to take the focus of the committee off of why they are there. There have been substantial charges by substantial people that private citizens at the time entered into a possible deal with a foreign government. I mean, that is completely outside the scope. And I of course, would agree with you as you take depositions and so forth and so on. During that period of time, Jimmy Carter was President of the United States, and certainly that's going to come into play. But I think that the two things that we have to remember about this is, number one is that Jimmy Carter was the duly elected President of the United States and was exercising his authority under the Constitution. And the other is that I suspect that this may be a dilatory tactic to try to thwart the purpose and the direction of the investigation. So I would encourage you not to...
Gentleman Neal, I understand that, but I'm saying that since we are going to probably end up dealing with the administration, if this were one of the few blocks that might be stopping the partisanship from taking place, that we probably could just make it part of the resolution.
Well, Mr. Chairman, that isn't going to stop the partisanship of the situation. That, as I said, in my opinion, is merely a dilatory tactic. We went through, and of course, our very able chairman of the Iran-Contra thing was here, and he can speak to this better than I, but my observation was that one of the reasons we never got to the bottom of that, that investigation was lost before we ever got started, because we put all of these different periods and limitations and so forth. And as we well know, this thing could get in. I mean, it has been pointed out, it could take more time here and more time there. And if the minority, and I believe that they do, I believe that they sincerely do, want to get to the truth of the matter, I think that we need to focus on what no one has accused President Carter of doing anything other than exercising his prerogatives as President of the United States.
Thank you. Mr. Quillen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Already the partisan angle is developing right here in this committee. I have every respect in the world for you, Mr. Hamilton, and I know that you are going to do as best job that you know how to do. No question. Job that you know how to do. No question about it. But then all the effort to exclude the name of President Carter would indicate that it's partisan in its own right. Like there's a cover-up. And we don't want to start any investigation or any hearing under the assumption that it's one-sided or that there's going to be a cover-up in regard to one administration or the other. I think the purpose of it is to get the facts in the case, and why ignore the minority? I mean, we're going to face it. So let's get down to business and say, yes, we want the name of Carter included in the resolution, as the Senate supposedly did. I haven't seen that, but the word I have is that he's included. So if we try not to exclude his name, then it tends to create in the minds of the American people that you're covering up a Democratic administration and you're zeroing in on a Republican administration. Let's face it, it isn't right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Quillen. Gentleman from California, Mr. Bielenson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have much to say other than that I am reassured by the presence and by the words of our friend from Indiana, Mr. Hamilton, whose presence as chairman of this inquiry, I think is reassuring to all of us. And if I may say so, by the apparent fact that Mr. Hyde, our friend from Illinois, will be the ranking Republican member, as well as the other people whom the distinguished minority leader is apparently about to appoint, to Mr. Leach, Mr. Goss, Mr. B. Ryder, Ms. Snow. I mean, that's a superb group of people, as are the folks who will be on the Democratic side, too. And I think the reality of it is exactly the same as Mr. Hamilton said earlier, that once we get past whatever words or posturing or, expressions of feeling that people apparently feel necessary to make here in this committee today and on the floor, eventually when the rule is before it, I'm sure all of us understand underneath that this very able group of people, with the able leadership of Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Hyde, will carry out their duties, unpleasant and difficult as they may be, as quickly and as reasonably and as decently as possible, and they'll come to whatever conclusion they come to, and it'll be useful for all of us. And so I'm not worried, Mr. Chairman, overly about just a couple of matters that seem to stand between the two parties at the moment. They're not awfully important, and they'll be resolved in reality and practicality perfectly decently, and these folks will come to their conclusions and will be helpful and useful to all of us and to our nation. And we wish them well.
Thank you, Mr. Bielenson. Mr. McEwen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Hamilton, you are fully aware of the deep respect which I have for you. Our districts are less than 30 miles apart, and I have admired you for a long time, and I'm not at all surprised that in an activity of this sort that the majority party would seek to have you lead with the respect and that you've engendered for many, many years in the Congress. I specifically was impressed by the effort with which you spoke about the evils of arms for hostages on the floor of the House during the Iran-Contra hearing, eloquently in national television and repeatedly. I'm curious as to what has taken place in the interim in the recent weeks that you are now so sanguine about the idea that a president would be engaged in this sort of activity, that you would now share with the committee that you point out that Mr. Carter was president at the time, he was entitled to conduct foreign policy, that his participation in these activities are not particularly important, and yet you have asked of the current Secretary of State, Mr. Baker, all of the relevant papers and documents going back to 1979. If this activity was going on, if, as I heard on the radio this morning, the estimation of offers of $150 million, and the reporters were not sure if that was for all the hostages or if that was for individual hostages, that this was the October surprise that Mr. Reagan was so nervous about during the summer of 1980. I'm curious as to what has taken place, that if that activity was going on, and if the Senate feels obligated to include it in at least the investigation, and if, as you pointed out, you hope to get to the bottom of this effort, why are you so deliberately discounting what is obviously the source of the dilemma?
Mr. McEwen, first of all, thank you for your gracious remarks. Secondly, I certainly do not mean to suggest, if I did suggest, that the role of President Carter here is unimportant. What I did mean to suggest is that the allegations that have floated now for a decade about misconduct, and it's very important to say that they are allegations, have related to the conduct of the Reagan campaign team. I am not aware that during these past 10 years or so there are allegations of misconduct against President Carter and his foreign policy. There may be dispute about that policy, whether it was good or a bad policy, but I am not aware of allegations about abuse or misconduct by the Carter administration.
You are aware, are you not, as the chairman stated, that the term October surprise refers directly to back-channel negotiations that were going on between Mr. Carter and the rulers of Iran at the time, and that is where the term originates.
Well, I am aware that the Carter policy, there were negotiations obviously in the Carter administration to bring about the release of those hostages. And so there were certainly contacts going on, and I am aware that the Republican campaign team at that time thought that there was a possibility of an October surprise. I am not aware, however, that there are allegations of abuse of power by President Carter at that time. And if you're suggesting that, then let's have some facts come forward to put it forward.
So you would not object to giving us the forum whereby that could be done? You would expand the investigation to the same wording in the Senate so that if we had such allegations, we could present it to you?
I'm reluctant to endorse the Senate language simply because I haven't seen it. And I asked for it this morning but did not get it in time. What I'm saying to you is I think if you or your colleagues want to raise questions with regard to the Carter policy at the time, I think the scope of the resolution as drafted permits you to do that. If inserting the words Carter administration somewhere in this resolution would thereby bring you around as an enthusiastic supporter of the resolution, I would be happy to very seriously consider that. And the chairman has made clear his own interest in the possibility of exploring that language. I'm prepared to do that.
Well, of course, I would assure you that my support is not up for sale, that by engaging in one witch hunt is not my desire, and engaging in two witch hunts is not necessarily my desire either. So adding Carter to it would not necessarily buy my support, especially when a distinguished leader from Indiana, former chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, said this is simply a grand jury headed by George Mitchell. Regardless, even though Carter is included in that, he understands the concerns that people have in going back some 12 years to engage in a political activity with taxpayer dollars when the chairman of the committee says that the activity of the president during the time is, quote, not particularly important. And that causes me to be somewhat reluctant. Not particularly important. With respect to the allegations that have been made. In other words, I have not heard yet in this hearing any specific allegations with respect to abuse by the Carter administration. What I have heard as we've looked into this is a lot of concern about abuse by the Reagan campaign team. I don't for a moment make the assumption that those allegations are correct. I frankly do not know. And I have found that there are a lot of people in this country, and probably a good many in this Congress, who know more about the various allegations at this point than I do. I do want to speak to the phrase witch hunt that has been used several times here. I'm not sure precisely what people mean by witch hunt. It has a very pejorative context to it. It is not my intent to conduct a witch hunt. Whatever that may mean, and I suspect it doesn't mean anything very favorable. But let us assume for a moment that the allegations are true. You cannot say they are not true, I suspect. What then is our responsibility? If we did not look into these events, would we at a future time be harshly criticized? I think we would be. I'm not sure what the word witch hunt means here, frankly. Maybe you and I can help each other on this. My question is, assuming that you find there is some misconduct, where do we go from there? What is your intent of the committee?
That's a fair and a very difficult question.
Hence the term, the fear of the witch hunt, as to what is going to be accomplished here.
A lot depends on what we find, of course. Under the resolution, we have the responsibility to make findings and to make recommendations. A lot of people think immediately in terms of the criminal law, and of course we have no power with respect to the criminal law. It's possible we would choose to make some recommendations with respect to current law and what private citizens can and cannot do with respect to conducts with foreign government. But I really don't know how to answer your question as where we will end up. You know where I hope we end up? I hope we end up and find that these allegations are not true. That's my sincere hope.
Mr. Chairman, I'm really nervous about that, if that were the goal, because if that were the goal, then we would have a time-specific, a time to form a conclusion, a limited amount of money, and we would say this is what we're going to, and at that point we will conclude yay, nay, or indifferent. But when we come and we have unlimited amounts of funds, unwilling to set a timeline, unwilling to put a point at which we will form any conclusions, that makes a person suspicious, number one. Secondly, let me add, Can you share with me, Mr. Chairman, what limitations are upon you as a chairman of the leading subcommittee of Foreign Affairs that prevents you from investigating this sort of activity that would, if the goal of this is merely to see if current law is effective and make any recommendations to the Congress about laws that need to be changed, why must we have a special resolution, a special committee, and a specific target in order to engage in the activity which you said is sole the purpose of the committee?
Well, I don't know that I'm the best one to answer that question. That determination was really made by the Speaker, and he chose, and the Majority Leader in the Senate. They obviously proceeded in different ways. The Majority Leader in the Senate going to the Foreign Affairs or Foreign Relations Committee and to a subcommittee of that committee for the conduct of the investigation. In the case of the House, and only the Speaker can really speak to this, I think he chose to go to Mr. Fussell and recommend it as chairman of the committee, and then recommended using a task force. From my standpoint as chairman of a subcommittee of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, let me just say we have a very, very full plate with events that are happening in the Middle East and Europe, including the Soviet Union today, and it would have been very, very difficult for that subcommittee to carry out this investigation. Very difficult.
And yet you'll be able to find the additional burden in the time and how?
Well, look, every member of this institution is overburdened in terms of responsibility and has more than he or she can do.
Well, I would say to my friend, I'll leave off as I began, that this activity is severely sullied, and it is...
Severely what?
Sullied and dirtied, tainted.
Okay.
And I regret to see my friend carrying this burden into what I believe will be a, but you don't need to worry about my concerns for you, I understand. But nevertheless, I think that even a cursory observation, the questions come to the fore that I've just posed them. What specific laws were broken? What is the goal? How long will it last? How much will it cost? And at the conclusion, what will we conclude? And then having done that, what changes? And one has to observe that this is severely, severely politically motivated. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. McEwen, I'm not insensitive to your concerns, and I will try to be responsive to them to the best of my ability in the context of the resolution as we move along.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Wheat.
Mr. Chairman, I had not intended to make a statement, but I am disturbed by the suggestion that this investigation is politically motivated. Obviously, the allegations about the conduct of activities in 1980 are not only quite serious, but they are also very sobering. And none of us want to believe that there were any U.S. citizens, whether in government or out of government, who were involved in actions that would have led to U.S. hostages being held longer than absolutely necessary. But I think the key question is what Mr. Quillen pointed out. He said that it would be unfair not to look at one administration's activities and compare them against the other administration. The point is, however, that there were not two administrations. There was only one administration. The President of the United States was duly authorized to conduct foreign policy, and whether we agreed with that foreign policy or not, the President did have the constitutional authority to carry it out. Obviously, President Carter was not successful in bringing home the hostages during his term in office, and we would have all liked to have seen that. But as to whether private citizens interfered or hindered the conduct of that foreign policy is such a serious allegation, I don't see how we could maintain our responsibility and our duties if we did not investigate it. I think there is some political posturing going on here today. If the name President Carter, if including President Carter's name in this resolution were to pull both sides of the aisle together to recognize that it's important that the truth be known about the allegations, then I think it would be important to do so. But I think it would be fair to do so in such a way as to phrase it in a manner asking whether private citizens interfered with the foreign policy that was being conducted by President Carter at the time. I'm fully confident that both sides of the aisle, led by Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Hyde, can conduct a fair, thorough investigation. I, like everyone else, hope that the results of the investigation will be that no private citizens interfered with the conduct of foreign policy, but I think the question deserves an answer.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, I had one more that I missed, if I could. Could you give me your thoughts on why it is we should not combine this? Instead of having two Inspector Clouseaus interviewing Mr. Garbonifar, making his trips to Paris and all this kind of thing, why can we not have a joint hearing and get this over with between our joint committee between the House and the Senate?
Well, it takes two to tango, and my understanding is that the Senate would not approve that. We do intend to work, and I know this doesn't fully meet your concern, very, very closely with the Senate. A lot of the, I've talked with Senator Sanford about it, who is the chairman there. We recognize the possibility of duplication and all of that, and we want to reduce that as much as we possibly can, and we intend to do it. That means, for example, that when depositions are taken, probably the Senate and the House counsels will be present in most cases, both majority and minority. And there really will be an effort for coordination. But the gentleman puts his finger on an important problem, and we'll do our best to try to alleviate the duplication.
The gentleman, you alluded, Mr. Hamilton, to the phrase witch hunt. I think I used it first. And I still think it's a witch hunt, in that the Iran-Contra hearings turned out to draw a blank. Ollie North was free. And Walsh now is still in existence, using taxpayers' money. I think we should abolish it. As the gentleman from Ohio pointed out, what are you going to do after you end it? Then appoint a special prosecutor, go on and on and on and on, and it is a witch hunt. It's a partisan witch hunt. Here it is, 10, 11 years later, just before a presidential election, when all of a sudden we want to investigate what President Reagan did to free the hostages, if he did anything at all. Why this late date?
Mr. Quillen, you and I probably have some differences with respect to what Iran-Contra did and did not accomplish. Let me just point out to you, there have been 8 convictions as a result of that. And the various kinds of crimes, that's correct, but I don't consider a misdemeanor necessarily inconsequential. The $40 million you referred to is, I don't know where the figure comes from, but I suspect you're talking about the amount of money the special prosecutor has spent.
That is correct.
Special prosecutor, of course, was appointed by President Reagan, not by the Congress of the United States. I supported the appointment of that special prosecutor, and I don't want to try to dodge the responsibility for it. But I think you're asking me a question that simply cannot be answered when you ask me, where does this investigation come out? I don't know where it comes out. The purpose of the investigation is to find out the facts. If you want a simplistic answer, that we will end up with where the facts tell us to go. But that doesn't tell you very much either. But it's our intent to let the facts guide us. And when we have those facts in front of us, then we will make our findings and our recommendations. And what those recommendations will be, I don't know. The resolution specifically says, I believe, if I recall it correctly, that it's quite possible we will find nothing, and we will make that quite clear. If that's what the facts show us, I will not have the slightest hesitation to get up on the floor of the House of Representatives and say we have investigated this and we find no substance to the allegations. And let me tell you, if that is in fact the end result of this, there will be a great cloud that has been removed from the history of that period.
Thank you for yielding.
Mr. Hamilton, thank you very much. Very honored to have the minority leader of the House, the Honorable Robert Michael of Illinois.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for the opportunity to appear before you this afternoon
on this proposed investigation into what is now being called October Surprise. I'd like to provide you, if I might, with my perspective on this. First, I don't believe there is any credible evidence indicating a need for the investigation. Most of the allegations of a conspiracy have come from Gary Sick, a former National Security Council staffer under President Carter. In fact, he's releasing a new book shortly in time for this investigation entitled now, as I understand it, October Surprise. No coincidence. The formal request for this investigation comes on top of the thousands of dollars, millions of dollars spent on the General Accounting Office investigation secretly requested and monitored only by members and staff of the majority party. And I say secret because when the ranking Republican member of the Government Ops asked the chairman if he had requested a GAO investigation, he was told no. It comes on top of years of secret Democratic staff work investigating these rumors, and yet what has been produced? I've seen no hard evidence to back up any of these allegations. Granted, I'm not privy to the information the Speaker or the Majority Leader may possess. And no one has offered to show me this evidence if it does exist. I've asked and have not yet to see on what basis they have made their decision that there's sufficient evidence to proceed here. Later, we met with the Speaker to work out some accommodation on this resolution. We asked that the resolution include an investigation in the actions of the Carter campaign and his administration, and that the investigation end within a reasonable amount of time, and we said 6 months, and conceded that if there were problems to go beyond that on motion of the chairman, Mr. Hamilton, why, we'd be amenable to going beyond that, just that there be some terminal point here. We further requested that correct rules be applied to the operation of the task force. Our requests were not met. Without these important provisions, I have little confidence that the task force will examine the entire history of the episode. We'll not conduct this investigation in a timely fashion, and that will avoid election year posturing, nor will the rights and privileges of the minority be guaranteed in the task force. The reason for including former President Carter is simple. One must place any action in the context of the times. Now, former Carter aide Gary Sick acknowledges in his book, All Fall Down, that Carter approved transferring $150 million in military supplies to the Iranians in return for the American-held hostages, as hostages. Now, there's no other way of describing that other than saying it was an attempt to swap arms for hostages. That was the official policy of the government, apparently. Now, at the same time, President Carter was telling the American people publicly that he would not deal arms for hostages. He was doing something quite different in private. And this was contrary to his own executive order, which precluded trade with Iran. Mr. Casey is alleged to have proposed a $40 million arms deal with the Iranians. You cannot consider the feasibility of this offer without putting it in the context of a much bigger deal proposed by the incumbent then President of the United States. What person would accept $40 million from a challenger's campaign when the incumbent president is offering a deal 4 times as big? The Carter arms for hostages attempt was, as you recall, the original October surprise feared by the Reagan campaign. That was Bill Casey's straw man out there that he set up. So how are we going to investigate October surprise if we leave out the real October surprise? I should note that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee adopted an amendment to their resolution to include inquiry into allegations that U.S. citizens or government officials acted to manipulate the time of the release of the U.S. hostages in Iran in relation to the 1980 presidential election. Apparently, the Senate sees some merit in the allegations that Mr. Carter may have been manipulating their release. I also believe the Congress and the American people have little stomach for an open-ended, open-funded investigation into these rumors. This institution's lost tremendous credibility in the past few months, and the specter of this House spending millions of dollars again chasing 10-year-old rumors, I don't know that that's going to enhance the credibility or the respect for this institution. But Mr. Hyde, I've appointed, assuming that the resolution is going to be adopted, and I have to probably assume our substitute would not be adopted. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Solomon, I'm sure will be offering some amendments. The members whom I picked, and incidentally it's going to be 8 Democrats, 5 Republicans. The 5 Republicans who I've chosen are all members of this committee will, I'm sure, have to acknowledge, have the highest respect of all their contemporaries in the House of Representatives, fair, honest, decent individuals who will carry out their role and responsibility if that's their charge. Now, they may very well testify pretty much in concert with the tenor of my testimony here, but if the resolution is approved, they're going to do their job like they're charged to do and discharge their responsibility. So I would hope, Mr. Chairman, well, first of all, of course, that our substitute resolution would be the form that it would take. If not, of course, a consideration to at least several of those amendments on the limitation of the time, certainly the specific reference to the previous administration, and that the rules that normally would apply for an investigation of this kind be very strictly adhered to. And with that, Mr. Chairman, happy to
Thank you, Mr. Michael. Mr. Derrick, any questions?
Oh, I have no questions other than, Mr. Michael, I can commend you and congratulate you on the members that you appointed. I would certainly agree with you that they have the highest respect, and if you had to pick out a dozen or so members in the House, they would fall into that category.
I concur on that statement.
I
See
thank you for that.
how partisan he is? Mr. Quillen?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Michael, you've brought out some very interesting points there why the Carter administration should be included. And I think that it would be a tragedy not to embrace an investigation of that administration during that period of time. And I congratulate you.
Well, I want to say, too, Mr. Quillen, that I did mention it in my formal testimony. The thought just occurred to me. I knew Bill Casey well, a friend of mine, wily old character that he was, no question about that, distinguished career and during World War II and all the rest, leading up to a position he had. But he won't be around, you know, to defend himself in any kind of given set of circumstances. His wife, Sophia, or widow, Sophia, also a good friend. And like so many of our wives who never know for sure what we're doing, or certainly not privy to all the conversations and things we've engaged in our dealings with our colleagues around here, you know, could not respond. So it's, you know, in part my concern there that poor Bill is not around to defend himself, and then there's always that, you know, thing swirling around. But if, and I have the utmost respect for my friend Mr. Hamilton from Indiana, and listened particularly when he said, you know, he would hope that in the end, after running it all out, there would be nothing, and that, but then it would be laid to rest, as the gentleman from South Carolina also made mention earlier, and well, I would abide by that.
Mr. Bielenson, any questions? Mr. McEwen?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Michael, recognizing that we have the capacity to do any sort of hearings on laws that may have been violated in our current committee structure, and since this is set up for the purpose of investigating something that may have happened several years ago, in which the parties, according to Mr. Hamilton, mentioned we have no criminal authority, so it has to be merely speculative and investigatory. And recognizing that in situations like this in the Congress, when we investigate perhaps misconduct by members, the committee that does that is on a bipartisan basis, equal ratio, Democrats and Republicans. Can you give me any thoughts as to why this needs to be a partisan breakdown with a significant greater number of Democrats and Democrat staff and majority investigators, as opposed to having an equal basis for such an investigation?
Well, I don't know why, and I'm not altogether sure whether I ran that down to the nth degree with the speaker at the time he was initially talking about. I think I did say something about it. Would it be equally equal representation? I think that conversation centered on whether or not we were going to go outside the committee structure with a select committee routine, and I recall the speaker's response was we would attempt to keep it within the bounds of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and then of course he said under those circumstances we would use our use the regular ratio that applies to the full committee at the subcommittee level, although you're not bound by the specific subcommittee that might have primary jurisdiction. And I said, well, for that I appreciate, because quite frankly, we look at it maybe a bit different than you do, and we would want to have a little bit different mix conceivably on that subcommittee. And and of course, it's evident by the number of people, by those whom I've chosen as the 5 on our side.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Bonia, any questions? Mr. Michael, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
Good. Very happy to have a dear friend, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Henry Hyde.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to be brief. First of all, I too am delighted that Lee Hamilton is chairing this committee. I couldn't think of a more appropriate person for this delicate job. And secondly, if there is a legislative purpose, and I'm not sure I see one here, but if there is, we sure might take a look at the Logan Act, revive some interest in it, and maybe bring it up to date, because this is not the only time in my memory in this body that people have negotiated with other governments that had no right to do so. So it would be interesting to, maybe that could be a legislative purpose, I don't know. These are serious allegations, no question. They are very serious allegations. I'm not sure the Constitution is shaken or assailed, as some have said, but indeed they're serious allegations. Parenthetically, I note the persistence of the conspiracy theory. I thought at one time only members of the John Birch Society felt that, that a conspiracy lay at the heart of all of the ills of this government and this country. I later learned there are people, sincere, good, decent, honest people who are concerned about the POW-MIA issue, as am I and as is everyone, but who are convinced there is a conspiracy to not bring our boys home. And I don't know what one can ever do to convince them that that is not so. And so I have learned that people who believe in the conspiracy theory are very hard to convince, and I'm not sure anyone who believes this conspiracy will ever be convinced otherwise. People are dead that are involved at the very heart and soul of this issue, and not just Bill Casey, other people as well. And I fear an inconclusive result. I think people's reputations would be besmirched forever, even with an inconclusive result. And that is very easily predicted from where we're going. Every allegation doesn't demand a full-dress task force of the Foreign Affairs Committee or any Foreign Affairs Committee. Serious allegations. But I am informed that months and months have gone by and the GAO has been secretly investigating this, no written report and no knowledge or information to the Republicans. Hence, partisanship does raise its head. The taint of partisanship is understandable when a whole investigation has been going on without our knowledge, without our participation, without any report. So if someone wants to talk about posturing and wants to talk about politicizing what should not be politicized, I can understand that, and I deplore that, whether you believe that or not. But I really deplore the investigation that was going on and the substantial resources of this Congress that were expended in the dark without Republicans knowing about it. I think that taints the liftoff of this whole situation. Now, Carter, why Carter? Frankly, I'd like neither name mentioned. I would like language that says any and all citizens, governmental and otherwise, who are engaged in something like that. But if you're going to mention the R word, we Republicans want the C word. Why? Not because Carter wasn't president and Casey was not and was just a citizen, but because the context of what went on is critical. The fact that $150 million was offered to the Iranians by the Carter administration in October of 1980, and they never got an answer. Now, these military supplies and weapons were paid for by the Shah, but they were embargoed. But there was an offer, if Gary Sick is to be believed in his book, there was an offer for arms for hostages. Now for Casey or anybody else to come along, Richard Allen, Judge Silberman, you name it, to come along and offer $40 million in weapons on an if-come basis, if we get elected and if we supplant Carter, doesn't add up. That's nonsense. That would indicate the Iranians were willing to take from a candidate less than they would take from the president. So that's why it's important. I do not equate the Carter administration, which had the obligation and the duty to do what they were doing, and I don't fault them for doing it. But I say it's important to measure against what is alleged against Casey to see if it makes any sense. It's context. That's all, context. But that's why Carter's important. And our people say if you're going to name Reagan, you ought to name Carter because he was part of the context in the picture. It would satisfy me to name neither. Let me suggest to you, I want to vote for a resolution. I don't want us to be polarized. I don't want us to start off, as evidently the other body has, in bitter acrimony. But we need three things. We need parity when it comes to political campaigns and the Carter and the Reagan. We need some parity, verbal parity, with the understanding we're talking about context. Secondly, we do need a time limit, but we certainly would agree upon a proper showing to extend the time. But time limits have a way of driving people to get this thing done. If your thesis has to be turned in by Friday, Thursday you're going to work on it, and so are you going to work on it Wednesday. But if it's just going to drag on and on and on, it gives the aura of a fishing expedition to this, and it's not helpful. But I don't think anything substantive is lost if we can have a time when this thing should wind up subject to extension by vote of the House with some good cause shown. So that's really not a problem. Thirdly, there are procedural protections, which we want, which are mentioned in our substitute resolution, which are not at all improper or overreaching. And if those procedural protections, if a time certain with a proviso that it be extended and some balance between the administrations, I will vote for the resolution. I will vote for it. I don't know if any of my colleagues will, because they do feel strongly that this is born in partisan politics, and they have reason to believe it from what the GAO was doing in the dark for months. But I'll vote for it, and I'll speak for it and ask that we have a bipartisan investigation because these are serious allegations, and they've gone so far that they ought to be dispelled. I wish we had a joint committee. I really do not understand why we're going to reinvent the wheel. I don't know how the other body is going to work. By the way, they have not mentioned Carter. Their language is here, and it says, United States citizens or government officials acted to manipulate the timing of the release of the United States hostages in Iran in relation to the 1980 presidential election. The subcommittee may. But again, for psychological reasons, if you're going to mention the R word, we want the C word, or neither, but encompass an investigation that includes not just questions during hearings, but subpoenas and depositions, if necessary, to fully explore the context. Because were I defending the Casey activity, I would say that 40 million from a candidate is nonsense as against 150 million from the president. So that's why it's important, and it's not an attempt to equate the two. Lastly, I wish this could be a joint committee. I think we could save a lot of time and a lot of money. I note that the other body, in their resolution or whatever this document is, signed by Senator Sanford and Senator Jeffords, says we will cooperate with the House Task Force to reduce time and expenditures, but will not compromise the need for confidentiality, security, or nonpartisanship. Now, I hope they don't mean that they don't leak any more than we do, or less than we do, but I look upon this as lacking the comity that one would expect from a gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Sanford. So there may be some time to still negotiate a resolution if there can be balance between the C word and the R word, if there can be a time with permission to extend it, but I'd like to drive this thing to a conclusion. If there can be the procedural protections we want, I think that we might get, if not a bipartisan vote, we'll get a lot, we should get some Republicans in support of it. Because I think you would have gone a long way to accommodate us, and I think that would show good faith. Something that we all need right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. Any questions? Any questions?
First of all, if I may, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ellison.
I quite agree with you. Unfortunately, it's sad about your comments about people who believe in conspiracies, not only the ones you mentioned, but there's some on the other side, too. I mean, I got a lot of, I guess they're friends, I'm not sure, back home who believe anything anybody ever says about the CIA or about Mr. Reagan or whatever. In fact, the gentleman from Illinois and I were both targets of such an author recently in Harper's Magazine who just took entirely out of context a very minor episode that we were involved in, and I mean, for no reason, no apparent reason at all, except that he wanted to make a case that there was no basis in reality. So that unfortunately is true. You all can come out unanimously and say that absolutely no information, none of these things panned out, and we're going to have an awful lot of people out there believing they did anyway. That's a very unfortunate fact of American life these days on both sides of the political spectrum. Let me ask you two specific questions, if I may, Henry, about suggestions you made or things you asked for. The first with respect to an extension, you know, a time limit of 6 months or thereabout, and an extension. I think you mentioned an extension by vote of the House. I think Mr. Hamilton was mentioning the possibility perhaps of, or someone earlier on, I'm not sure, that the committee itself, the task force itself, could determine if it hadn't completed its work and, you know, was on to things, or it felt it needed some more time, that it itself could make that decision. Would it necessarily, in your view, in order to placate or satisfy you and some of your colleagues, have to be a re-vote by the entire House? Or?
No. I would submit it to the Rules Committee. I think somebody outside of our committee should look at what we've done and say there's enough to go on, or, you know, wind it up, boys. If there's a dispute that we have enough credible information.
I happen to agree with you that it's useful to.
Mind the Rules Committee.
It's always useful to have a date certain to aim at, because it does make you work at things. But I also believe, I also agree very strongly with Mr. Hamilton's, you know, very sensible remarks, that talking about the problems you're going to get into with foreign governments, with subpoenaing, with whatever, with investigations perhaps, or clearances, that you all won't be able to control the amount of time. It may become very obvious to you and to your Republican friends on the task force within 2-3 months that you're going to need more than 6 months. I don't know.
It may well be.
And if that were the case, I'd only suggest that if you all could agree amongst yourselves that you obviously needed an extra 3 or 4 months, whatever it might be, that it wouldn't have to come back to the entire House.
92 is, I agree, we don't have to go back to the House. I would have some outside authority take a look at it and give us the benefit of their advice. And I would be happy to submit that to the Rules Committee.
I mean, sadly, it may take you 3 months to put yourselves together and even get started, and even you yourself will figure out that you're going to need a little bit more time.
A lot of the spade work has been done on this, I suspect. The cast of characters is identified. What is needed are depositions under oath from these people, weighing them, credibility, believability. There is some running around to do over in Europe and in the Middle East, and you're going to need Iranians, the Iranian government's cooperation. Well, the foreign minister has made a statement on this already.
I don't.
But I think it could be done.
I don't disagree with you. I'll just.
But by July, Tony, by July 1st, we're only talking about 3 more months till we're going to adjourn. It's an election year. We're not going to stay till November. I don't believe. And I just want somebody's feet to the fire, and I'm perfectly willing to extend it but if they're going nowhere and they've interviewed a lot of people, at some point, I think we look foolish if we just
continue. My second question, if I may. You spoke for your third point that you all would require in order to support this measure some procedural protections.
Right.
Do you have specific ones in mind?
Sure. They're all in our resolution, but.
And how do they differ from the procedures?
Well, requiring at least 2 members to take deposition testimony rather than 1 member or 1 staffer. That guarantees a bipartisan presence. 2, requiring the task force...
One from each party?
Right.
Okay, specifically.
Requiring the task force to vote on subpoenas rather than delegating this authority to the chairman. By the way, I would insist on timely attendance at these things. As the ranking member, I would join Mr. Hamilton in being very upset if somebody were delaying this sort of thing by a requirement that both parties be there and we were dragging our feet. I would not tolerate that, and I just want you to know. 2, requiring the task force to vote on subpoenas rather than delegating the authority to the chairman. I think there's some room there for some negotiation, but 3,
involving the ranking
requiring a majority of members to be present to close meetings or hearings as required by the House rules, rather than permitting as few as 2 members to do so.
Even if those 2 were from different parties? Is that what the proposal is now? Do you know? Or is that not clear?
I don't know what it is now, but
okay.
As few as 2 members, and I'm sure it can be of one party. We just feel a majority of the members ought to be present to order the close of a meeting or a hearing. And then lastly, we want the task force to abide by the same House rules as standing committees, rather than it should be given special privileges and exemptions that might jeopardize the reputations of witnesses in the House. That language is in our resolution, and again, subject to negotiation.
It seems to me that some of those points might well be agreed to by the majority if you had a chance to speak to them.
I think the big hang-up is the time, and I think that isn't a hang-up if we phrase it right. But we need a date certain that this would dissolve unless some further action is taken. And you all could take that action, as far as I'm concerned, rather than go to the whole House. Ideally, though, we go to the whole House, but I'm not hung up on that. And then the C and the R problem. That is a psychological problem and a logical problem, too.
Would the gentleman yield just a moment?
Be happy to.
You know, this matter of the time, I mean, you know, Will Rogers once said, you know, congressmen are very personable guys, very nice people. Do they understand the damage they do? You know, we can all sit around here and be nice guys about, you know, it sounds very reasonable to put time. I mean, who could possibly argue with that? But the fact of the matter is that, and if you will talk private with a number of the members that served on the Iran-Contra one, which you did very able, the reason they never, one of the primary reasons they never got to the bottom of that was because there was so much dilatory tactics that were used that by the time they got to the point where they needed to proceed, the time limit was already up, and they never did get to the basis. If you really want to find out, if you want an answer to these questions, why do you have to have the time limit on there? It's you know, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, you lost. I mean, by the time we set the ground rules for the Iran-Contra things, which were very skillfully done, you know, we never were going to find out anything anyway, which we didn't. Which we didn't.
I hear the conspiracy theory raising its head here.
Well, no, I don't see it as, but,
first of all,
but Mr. Hyde, you don't want this investigation, and none of the crowd over here wants it. Of course you don't.
I am skeptical, but I intend to go at it.
No, you're more than skeptical. I disagree with you there.
Well, Mr. Derrick, you know my mind more than I then, I must say, and I admire you for that gift. I wish I had it. May I suggest to you, however, that the Iran-Contra didn't get anywhere for a lot of reasons, one of which they sent investigators over to Vienna to investigate things that didn't have a damn thing to do with Iran-Contra. But this was a grand fishing expedition. The sky was the limit. Ambassador Faith Whittlesey statements were taken, had nothing to do with Iran-Contra. Fascinating stuff. So if you really want to go into why they didn't get anywhere, they did not focus their investigation.
I mean, you know, are you a lawyer? I think you are.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, well, you know, I mean,
outstanding lawyer.
Well, as you and
thank you, Mr. Moakley.
As you and I know, most of your cases are won before you ever get to court, and that's when you set down the rules. And you know, I just think it's very important
that we not have a time limitation. What objection could you possibly have to having a, I mean, you know, if you believe, as I do, that there are people of good faith on both sides, Mr. Hamilton, the Democratic members, you, and I certainly don't question you, and you say that you have to give back a report to the Congress by July the 1st. And Mr. Hamilton, in his own testimony, said that, that even before then, but certainly by then, they would make a determination as to whether to proceed further. I mean, what possible objection could you have to that?
And I'm equally bewildered at what objection you have to terminating this by the resolution unless
because it encourages dilatory tactics. Because it encourages dilatory tactics. That's why.
I just disagree.
And we saw that done throughout the Iran conflict. I mean, my gosh, I mean, half of the witnesses that testified before the Iran thing, they've either written books or stated that, you know, and implication that everybody was lying.
I am loath to think that Mr. Hamilton and Senator Inouye, with their staffs, with the blue ribbon senators and House members from the majority party, which overwhelmed the minority, were so manipulated by the minority. I find that a confession of inadequacy I can't believe on the part of the majority.
Mr. Quillen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hyde, as usual, you do a bang-up job, and I congratulate you. And you raised a good point there about this investigation, which the Republicans knew nothing about. About having a partisan flavor to it, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. Another thing I can't resolve in my own mind, and you might help me, is why 11 years later are we going into this investigation just prior to a presidential election?
Well, I think each side suspects political motives from the other side. I think there has been a subterranean drive to get at Reagan, and Iran-Contra failed to do it. And this may be the next wave. I don't know. Let me say though, and I mean this sincerely, if these allegations are true, I think they're the most outrageous, despicable conduct by any human being that I've heard of this century. Asking people who are held as hostages, negotiating to keep them 1 day longer than they otherwise would be released, I think is as barbaric an act as anyone could conceive of. And if it's true, I will join in condemning whomsoever and from whatever station, political or otherwise, they stand, who is responsible for this. I make that statement as honestly as I can. That doesn't mean that I believe it's true. I think the very outrageousness of these charges make it likely that it is not true. But I will go into this wherever the truth leads me, and I know the people on our side are equally well motivated.
Well, I think you made a good point there too. I think it would be terrible to keep hostages as hostages for political purposes.
See, the reason I want the time limit is to give it an aura, an emanation from a penumbra of not being as political as many people think it is. And carrying it on up to the election gives it that aura. And I'm simply saying if you have by its terms a termination date that is a movable feast, you're not losing anything, but you're removing the notion that this is totally, purely politics. I am trying to move towards a resolution we can all vote for. I can vote for. I can't speak for anybody else, but I will speak for and vote for. If you will, and a compromise always is giving.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Frost?
I have no questions.
Mr. McEwen?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This committee would dissolve at the end of the 102nd Congress, right? Or,
I'm sure it does, yeah.
So that would be when we adjourn sine die. The election's in November. So the presumption is that we would adjourn sometime prior to the November election, probably 6, 7 weeks. So there is a time limit. The time limit is that you have to report about the middle of October or 1st of October or thereabouts of next year. One doesn't have to be a conspiratist to figure out that the reluctance, there is a timeline, is going to report. It's going to report shortly before the election. And what others are suggesting is perhaps we set some other time. And then suddenly we say, oh my goodness, this is 11 years old, and we can't limit it by 3 months or 90 days or some such other demand on the part of the minority. We have to take it fully up to the end of the session. I'm at a loss. Just it is so abundantly clear that no amount of rhetoric can obfuscate it. Can you share with me any reason, recognizing that there is no legal purpose to this, there can be no criminality involved, this will not be a legislative committee to write laws, since this is obviously, and you may term whatever term you wish to use, Mr. Quillen, you chose witch hunt, others would call it a fishing expedition, whatever the purpose is, can you share with me why there has to be a partisan imbalance on staff expenditures and membership?
Well, I don't know. If I was a Democrat and I had 101 more of us than there is of you Republicans, I'd probably want every official activity we do to reflect our superior numbers. Also, there is an anticipation that there may be some controversies over who said what and what it means, and who ought to be deposed and what subpoenas ought to be issued, what direction we're going in, and were I the majority party, I would want to retain that power and that control. I suppose that's the reason, and it was ever thus and ever will be.
Well, you feel compelled that even if there is some accommodation on the other points, that you'd feel compelled to support that when the apparent facts are that this is merely for investigation, and what's to be hidden, if we want to quote get to the bottom of it. Why do we have to have this imbalance of staff and expenditures? And
I would think if we get the staff we want, and we get the council and the staff and the investigators enough to cover all of the depositions and all of the interviews and all of the hearings, I would be satisfied. I don't need to have what the other side has. If we get what we want, which would be an adequate staff, adequate legal counsel, I think there is a built-in restraint on the majority here to keep this thing endlessly going without producing anything, and to spend a lot of money without producing anything. I think they will, the law of diminishing returns will set in, or as they say, the law of increasing disutility, and I think this may fall of its own weight.
When you're desperate and shortly before an election, sometimes even minuscule impacts can play a part. I posed this question to a previous witness, and I would pose it to you now. What has been this collapse of interest and outrage and moral disturbance about arms for hostages that we heard raging around the Capitol here for nearly 2 years, and suddenly now, when we have the testimony of the national security officer that was engaged in arms for hostages, that there is this sanguine approach that we dare not even discuss it or look into it or mention it during the 1979-80 time frame, but of course anything thereafter is a threat to the Constitution and the survival of the Republic.
Well, a lot of us have worried about the notion of trading arms to the Iranians for any purpose whatsoever while hostages were being held. And when the president did it, some of us felt it was justified because being held, our hostages in Lebanon are in a desperate situation and have been there 5, 6, 7 years. And sometimes you have to do certain things that not everyone agrees with. Would
you consider it within the purview of your committee, if this were to pass, to look into these charges by Mr. Sick that arms for hostages were offered?
This is an historical excursion about a very interesting period of our history, recent history. But I think the results will let us say that I don't even want to speculate that Mr. Casey said or did anything supportive of the thesis of these hearings. But I don't see any real result other than a statement that this deplorable conduct was engaged in, and we hope it never happens again. I'm not sure that it'll be worth the millions of dollars that may be spent on this. It may be in political dividends, but I don't know. On the other hand, there is a Logan Act. There is a law that says civilians should not negotiate and subvert a foreign policy of a legitimate government, of the government. That has never been enforced. I think it could be updated, should be updated, and ought to be enforced.
Okay.
But
well, thank you. My observation would be just to agree with with Mr. Bielenson. If we do find something, there's nothing that can be done with this committee. Parties are dead or no longer around, and the committee has no authority, criminal or otherwise. And so that is if it's positive. If it's not positive, as he mentioned, that no one's going to believe it, think is a whitewash anyway. So recognizing that we have a surplus in the budget and a desire to occupy our time because there are no other demands, why not whip out the fishing expedition and let's go?
Well, I would think if we could work with the Senate committee, we could save some of the money that undoubtedly will be spent if we go on parallel courses.
Thank you.
But anyway.
You know, it is an unfortunate convergence, I suppose, that this is coming up at the time of the election, because that doesn't interest me. But truth does, and I really have a consuming interest to see that we find out the truth. And if we put a time constraint on the truth and make it impossible for us to do this correctly so that people feel right about it, I'd rather not do it at all. And that is absolute my judgment. I would hate to see us do as we did before, and if we do, then we haven't learned a thing.
Well, if I just may say, Mrs. Slaughter, the Iran-Contra committee was too big. We had too many senators and House members.
It was a zoo.
And we had so many that needed accommodation.
It was embarrassing.
That was part of it. So it was institutional and it was structural. There were many other reasons.
If I may, Mr. Hyde, I want to make it clear that I'm not making that in a partisan way when I say that I thought that the whole thing was a disgrace, because I was quoted very shortly after arriving here when somebody said to me, "What do you think of the Democrats on the panel?" And I made a comment that they were sitting there like warts on a pickle, which, as you can imagine, endeared me considerably to this group when I first arrived. But I have felt to the depth of my being that one of the things that the American people believe is that we sweep it under the rug and that we don't know the truth. We dare not do that again. And I think that this is an opportunity for us to really find out the truth. Frankly, if nobody else in America wanted to know the truth, I'd want to. The Constitution, I think the Constitution is important enough for us to make certain that it is complied with. And I really want to know the truth. It's as simple as that. And I think that's our purpose.
If I may say, and not to attenuate this at all, I don't think the Iran-Contra hearings were a total waste at all, however. I think some good did come of it. I think learning that a member of the National Security Council could conduct intelligence operations off the books came as a shock to a lot of people. And I think that is very unlikely ever to happen again. I think the fact that Congress was lied to and that those lies were important, and we know the reasons why. I understand why, and these choices were made, but I think that fact came out loud and clear. And the fact that there were no convictions was a question of whether Congress, it is more important to have the hearings and get the story out than to convict somebody under the rules of evidence where the story might never have come out. And I think perhaps the right decision was made.
Given the brain power that supposedly came down, and Oliver North has a full-page ad today in, I think, the New York Times saying, "At last I can tell the truth." Well, frankly, I think he should have told the truth from the first, not at last.
Well, if he didn't, he should have been prosecuted.
Absolutely. But I'm waiting to hear somebody who sat on that committee and watched that man and went through all that saying, wait, Ollie, where did you get the stuff from this book?
Well, I'm not.
Why haven't we discussed that?
Yeah.
But no, I haven't heard that. I've been really waiting to have somebody say, for crying out loud, we were lied to, and I'm angry about it.
No, if you don't ask the right questions, sometimes you don't.
But maybe you
right
can if you've only got 5 minutes, Mr. Hyde.
Well,
That's
Lord, we
my
had
problem.
counsel. We had some of the best counsel, some of the most, not notorious, what shall I say, some of them who had the most notoriety.
Right.
Arthur Lyman and John Nels, we had lawyers coming out our ears. So they didn't ask the right questions. It's more a commentary on them. North was facing jail, prison. You can't blame him for not blurting out answers if he's not asked a question.
Well, we've had a lot of examples lately of people not wanting to ask the right questions on hearings, and I don't want to see this be another one. And I respect you as an extraordinary debater and a man who really understands his Constitution, and I think you'll do the best you can on that hearing to see to it that that's complied with. But I'm going to tell you right now, I don't view this as some kind of political witch hunt, and I resent that being said. But I wish we'd done it years ago. Why didn't we? I don't, you know, it's taken a good while to get to it. Nonetheless, it's going to be done, and I want it done correctly, and I don't think it can be done correctly if you say everybody's going to have 15 minutes to talk and then leave the room, and you're going to control it so much that truth is squeezed out, because that's not going to serve any of us.
Well, I'm not the chairman. You could direct those comments at the chairman who will run that. But as far as the political witch hunt, those words are inflammatory, but conducting an investigation for 6 months with the GAO in the secret without notifying the Republicans gives some color to that terminology. So anyway, thank you.
Any other questions of the panelists? Henry, as usual, thank you very much for
coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now we have the last witness, the Honorable Butler Derrick of South Carolina.
I will be glad to. I just really want to make a statement.
All right.
I'm going to hold it down short. You know, I, like Ms. Slaughter, resent the idea of this being a witch hunt. You know, it's something that I have been seriously concerned about since 1980, and that is why I became involved in it. You know, I remember at the time when the hostages were released within an hour or so after President Reagan was sworn in. And I remember thinking about it at the time and saying, you know, what is happening here? What is happening here? Why is this timing like this? There must be something else to it. And as we all know, when the Shah went down in the late 70s, he had the 4th largest military establishment in the world, and all of it was American equipment. And it had fallen into the hands of the Ayatollah Khomeini. And as we all know, as we go back to that time, the Carter administration had put an embargo on about $500 million worth of parts that the Shah had paid for this equipment. And as we all know, and we go back and we create the situation, Iraq was in the process of invading Iran. And as we know at that time, that the American equipment was really of very little use to Iran without these parts and without the ability to service. So there was a great deal of pressure on Iran to get these parts, to get this additional, these military weapons out of the United States. Still, at the same time, that was, in this country, the major political issue, the major issue, political or otherwise, on the front, with the Carter administration and with the Reagan team. So there was a lot of pressure coming from both sides. There is a
or at least there have been allegations that shortly after the president was sworn in, that arms started to flow, American arms, through another country into Iran, and that they were desperately needed. And there are allegations that that continued throughout, if not all, a good part of the Reagan administration. These questions have been raised. They're serious questions. The answers to them need to be found, because it is my opinion that it goes to the very roots of our democratic system. And people talk about our institutions, and they are in disrepute, unfortunately, today. But one of the ways that we can straighten out that disrepute is to prove that these things are either not true, or that if they are true, to bring them to the forefront. The very idea that we could let substantial allegations such as this go unnoticed or undealt with is beyond my comprehension. So I commend the Speaker for his actions. I am very pleased with the chairman that has been selected, and also the members on the minority. I do not consider it a witch hunt, and I expect that the truth will be found. But I think the resolution needs to be passed in its present form. As anyone, I think, that will go back and objectively review the Iran-Contra business, time was a factor. We're taking the position, or at least many of the people are taking the position, that it's going to go longer than 6 months automatically. That's not that's necessarily so. And if the true reason for the committee is to get at the truth, then what difference does the time factor amount to anyway? As to President Carter was President of the United States of America in 1980. He had the right to negotiate, the obligation to negotiate. And there's no cause for his name to be mentioned in a resolution. Certainly, as it will come up in depositions, and there would be no prohibition against that. But there is no reason, because no one has accused the Carter administration of any improprieties. I think it is most important that we deal with this matter, that we deal with it as quickly and get it over with as quickly as possible, and I recommend to the committee that we pass it. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else? Any statements from anybody?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just make one observation. Say that Mr. Carter was not accused of engaging in arms for hostages. That's correct, because the National Security Staff writer in the book that was quoted here confessed that he did that, and I find it novel.
I did not suggest that he was accused. I said he was not accused of any improprieties.
And the whole purpose of the Iran-Contra investigation was because arms for hostages was interpreted by this Congress as being an impropriety. And
the money was
excuse me, I'm sorry that I
failed
to
not
interject my thoughts when you were attempting to go through your monologue here, that I enjoyed as longly and lengthy as I'm sure that C-SPAN observers will as well. The facts are abundantly clear. They will be presented to the American people, and they will make their judgments as they did in the past, and I think that that's appropriate, regardless of how much time, effort, or money is wasted in this effort. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The committee will revisit this. The minority is petitioned to have an additional hearing to bring witnesses forward, and the majority is agreeing to that. So we will have another meeting on this as soon as we get the names and addresses of the witnesses that they want to bring forward, and they can testify before the committee. And on the other matter, we will revisit the banking bill at about 3:30 So the Rules Committee stands adjourned, subject to the call of the chair.
That concludes our coverage of Wednesday's meeting of the House Rules Committee. The committee is putting together a task force to investigate allegations concerning Iran's holding of American hostages back in 1980. Some charge that Ronald Reagan's 1980 campaign made a deal with Iran to delay the release of the 52 hostages until after Reagan's inauguration in 1981. This alleged event suggests that the Reagan camp wanted to ensure the hostages would not come home during the term of President Jimmy Carter as a, quote, October surprise. The delay would thus decrease President Carter's chances for re-election. For more information about the House Rules Committee activity, write to the panel at H312 at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. The zip code is 20515. From the nation's capital, this is C-SPAN 2, one of the two cable satellite public affairs networks. C-SPAN